Good morning and a very warm welcome to Murder One and to the Lexicon Centre. I'm delighted to see we've got such a lovely audience because it's a bit of a chilly, blowy morning here in Dunleary this morning. I am Sam Blake, I run Murder One, and as I said, we're in the Lexicon Library in Dunleary. The festival is brought to you this year by Dunleary Library sponsorship and also by the Arts Council, who are funding our live stream. And we have a whole world of people outside who are on the live stream and looking in and who will be watching the broadcast. And guys, if you're watching from home, you can put your questions into social media, put them into Twitter, the Murder One Fest stream, and we'll pick them up or DM any of the guys who you know here. And we'll be able to pick up the questions and we'll be able to answer them on set. So do make sure you send in your questions. An audience will be coming to you at the end for questions too. So this morning, this is the early morning Sunday shift is always the hardest, isn't it? Everybody has to be here early. We have Henrietta McKervey, Vaseem Khan, Sinéad Crowley and Bill Ryan. And I'm going to leave you now with Henrietta, who will introduce everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And hello, everybody here in the lovely Lexicon studio and those watching on the live stream. And a big Murder One welcome to A Criminal Past and the three guests kicking off today's amazing programme. As you've heard, we have Vaseem Khan, Sinéad Crowley and William Ryan. Each of our talented crime authors is going to read a short piece of their work before our conversation. But before that, allow me to introduce them. Sinéad joined RTE in 1997 as a reporter in Irish language programmes. Since then, she has worked in all areas of news, most particularly on the television side, and has been arts and media correspondent on TV, radio and online since 2006. So putting her full-time job aside for a moment, in the last 8 years, she has impressively also published 3 acclaimed crime novels in the DS Claire Boyle series. And it's her birthday today, so happy birthday, Sinéad. And this year, she published The Belladonna Maze, set at Halloween, so if you haven't already got it, it's the perfect read for this Halloween. This bestseller is a bewitching part ghost story, part domestic psychological thriller. The Irish Times review said, with just the right balance between realism and romantic, The Belladonna Maze is an atmospheric book full of everything you'd want from a suspenseful mystery. Vivid characters, a sumptuous setting, and an expertly crafted thread of malevolence. Well, malevolence is exactly what we're after here today, so that's good. Vaseem Khan is the author of 2 crime series set in India, the Baby Ganesh Agency series set in modern Mumbai, and the Malabar House historical crime novels set in 1950s Bombay. His first book, The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra, was a Times bestseller, now translated into 15 languages. Midnight at Malabar House, the debut in the Malabar House series, featuring India's first female police detective, Percy Swadia, won the CWA Historical Dagger, the preeminent prize for historical crime fiction. The second in the series, The Dying Day, is about the theft of one of the world's greatest treasures, a 600-year-old copy of Dante's The Divine Comedy. And the most recent, The Lost Man of Bombay, kicks off with the body of a white man found frozen in the Himalayan foothills. At the same time, there is a suspected serial killer on the loose in the city, which is the perfect storm for Persis and her sidekick, Metropolitan Police criminalist Archie Blackfinch. Vaseem is also part of the Red Hot Chili Writers Podcast Collective. He teaches an online creative writing course and has created a diversity project called Turning the Page, a guide to writing cultural diversity in fiction. My third guest is William Ryan, author of 5 novels, including the Captain Korolev series set in 1930s Moscow. They have been shortlisted for many awards, including the Theakston's Crime Novel of the Year, the Endeavour Historical Gold Crown, and the Crime Writers Association Steel Historical and New Blood Daggers. His novel, A House of Ghosts, set in 1917, has been described as an atmospheric, hugely entertaining mystery that offers all the pleasures of a classic ghost story with an appealing dash of romance. And if you haven't yet read that, I recommend you do. The premise is that at Blackwater Abbey, on an island off the Devon coast, Lord Highmount has arranged a spiritualist gathering to contact his 2 sons who died in battle. But as guests begin to arrive, it gradually becomes clear each has something they would rather keep hidden. And then a storm descends on the island and the guests find themselves trapped. So think Agatha Christie's and Then There Were None, with maybe a dash of The Woman in Black as well. So I would say between the three of you, we must have, I don't know, 45, 50 murders in the room. I was trying to do a tot. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing where the bodies are buried, which we will get to after some short reading. So I thought, William, we would start with you first, and then Vaseem, and then Sinead.
Great. This is from The Winter Guest, which is my latest novel, and the first one in which I write directly about Ireland, and it's about set in the War of Independence. Kilcolgan House stands at the end of the long drive, caught by a moment of moonlight. Its granite walls, slick with the earlier rain, shine silver. Its roof glows. Its many large windows are like mirrors to the sky. The bad weather has passed for the moment, and only the breath of a breeze flutters the long grass on the home meadow. From the strand through the trees, the roll of the waves can be heard. Here at the house, the only sound is the steady drip of leaking gutters. It is a large house, built to reflect the significance of the family who built it. It stands on a rise that overlooks the sea and the surrounding country. When the original Prendevils, hard-knuckled invaders in the service of a Tudor monarch, took the land, the first house they built was a bastion to defend against the people from whom the land was taken. It had thick walls and high, small windows, and a courtyard into which livestock could be brought in times of trouble. The bastion still stands within the dwelling that took its place, built onto and around and through. The older structure within accounts for the strange shapes of certain rooms, and some, at least, of the draughts and creaks and other phenomena that the Prendevils and their few remaining retainers barely notice. What might seem odd to a stranger is to them quite usual. They are accustomed to the ways of the house. They know its whims. Prendevils have become part of the fabric of the house, the dead living on in the stories held within its walls.
Thank you. Thank you. And Vaseem.
Okay, so this is from The Lost Man of Bombay, which is the third in the Malabar House series. So it's 1950, it's Bombay, it's a few years after Gandhi's assassination, the horrors of partition and Indian independence. And in this book, as Henrietta said, a white man has been found dead in the Himalayas. The only clues as to who he is and his identity are a notebook in his pocket with some cryptic information. Persis has to investigate in Bombay, and then another murder happens of a German Catholic priest in Bombay. And so Persis and Archie have been called out to investigate. The chapel sat on the very edge of a small slum. On the other side was the Crawford Market, where you could buy anything from piranhas to working chronometers. She parked the jeep on the road. The heat hit them like a cricket bat to the back of the skull. A blind beggar drew a creaky melody from a sitar set in his lap. She doubted that the sound of a cat being strangled was conducive to eliciting alms. Her eyes lingered on him, the bird-like bones of his face, the way poverty gripped him in its claws. The sight was becoming more common by the day as the city's population surged. Refugees and migrants drawn in from all corners of the country to Bombay, city of dreams. Outsiders who spent any length of time in the city often arrived at the erroneous conclusion that Bombay was an ancient metropolis. The run-down hangdog look of the architecture gave the impression of a place that had been around the block a few times, like an aging courtesan with rattling teeth and a bad case of halitosis. The Portuguese, the first of the city's foreign arrivals, had left behind a legacy of crumbling churches and a Catholicism so virulent it was said that the Pope himself now glanced eastwards before delivering Holy Communion. Subsequent Muslim invaders had dotted the city's Byzantine enclaves with mosques and minarets, adding the lilt of muezzin's calls to the general cacophony that bludgeoned new arrivals like cannon fire. Threading a way through a narrow opening, Persis proceeded along an alleyway smelling of urine and sewage, and into a lane darkened by overhead cables. At the top of the lane stood the chapel. A constable was ostensibly guarding the scene, passing the time with locals, slum dwellers. On a bench inside the courtyard, a portly priest in a white cassock sat mopping his bald skull with a handkerchief. The constable observed her approach, confusion gathering in his eyes. She was used to it by now, the cognitive dissonance generated by seeing a woman in an inspector's uniform for the first time. She was amazed her presence didn't incite nosebleeds.
Thank you. And Sinead, thank you.
Read a little bit from the Belladonna Maze. It's set in 3 different timelines, in the 1840s, 2007, and then there's a short little bit in the 1970s as well. So I'm going to read you a little bit from the 1970s. It's Halloween night, and a young woman called Catherine has been invited to a party in a big house called Hollow Park Hall. Now, there's a children's party going on in one part of the house, but she's 15, so she reckons she's far too big for a children's party, but she has been invited to another type of party in a maze. So we're going to catch up with her now. She turned and began to cross the wildflower meadow, moving slowly in her heels and hoping her ass was wiggling in a sexy and not an I'm going to fall sort of way. There was a crunching sound under her feet, and Catherine looked down to see small black berries littering the grass. Her dad would know what they were, she reckoned, but she couldn't even ask him because she'd have to tell him where she had been. And then she stopped as a high hedge loomed over her. The Hollow Park Maze. Catherine had heard about the maze, of course, had even read about it in her dad's book, but she'd never seen it before. It was always off limits on Halloween night because the Fitzmahons, it was said, were afraid that one of the small kids would get lost in there. Looking up at it now, its leaves so dark they seemed to merge with the night sky, it was easy to understand their fears, and the thought of walking inside it made Catherine's stomach clench with fear. If she turned now, she'd be back with the others in minutes. And then she heard a giggle floating towards her on the night air, and after it, a louder snort of laughter. She put one foot inside the entrance to the maze, and there was a smell of smoke now, and it wasn't cigarette smoke either, but the other kind, and the glamour of it, the sheer boldness of what lay ahead gave her courage, and she moved forward again. She turned her head one last time to look at the entrance, and for a moment she thought there was someone else in the maze with her. It looked like a woman the same age as her mam, a pale woman with her hair tied back. She was dressed up as a servant or someone from a very old film. And then she blinked, and the figure disappeared. A shadow, that's all it had been. And if anyone had been standing there on the edge of the wildflower meadow that night, they would have only seen a flicker in the blackness as Catherine Clancy, 15 years of age, in her skin-tight jeans and her borrowed high heels, rose onto her toes and strode forward with an assurance she didn't really possess, into the inky blackness of the Belladonna Maze. The leaves at the entrance rustled and fell still.
Very creepy. Thank you. 3 very different stories, all equally fascinating, and our authors will be signing copies of their books at the pop-up gutter upstairs, so if you want to buy a book and have it signed afterwards, you can. Now, William, am I right that you're a mudlarker?
I have mudlarked.
Right. Well, when I heard that first about you, I thought that seemed like the perfect thing for a writer of historical fiction. I'm sure people know mudlarking is scavenging in the mud for items of value or artifacts. And I was thinking that sort of...
That sounds bad.
I think it sounds fantastic. I'd love to do it. I think it sounds brilliant.
It's the Thames is a tidal river. I live in London, and so it actually has a clay which is... I can't remember what it's called now, but basically it preserves, kind of anything that falls into it for a couple of thousand years if necessary. And so you can find all sorts of very strange things down there. And because people find Roman dice, they find Anglo-Saxon stuff, they find Neolithic stuff, they find fossils. It's all sorts of interesting things down there. And it's not that muddy. Sometimes it is. But
well, it did make me think, but in terms of historical fiction, then, how do you decide what you're going to take and what you're going to leave behind? So, say when you're starting a new idea, how do you decide what's of value to that idea?
Well, I think the thing that's interesting about mudlarking for me, and I think for other people as well, is that you have a personal connection to somebody who lived in the past. And quite often, when I'm writing historical fiction, at least, what I'm trying to do is bring to life an ordinary person from the past. So historical fiction for me is a little bit like time travel writing. So I want to take you back to 1930s Moscow or 1920s Ireland or kind of wherever I'm taking you that week. And I want to put an ordinary person in these often extraordinary situations. But I also want to bring the day-to-day life alive for you. And that's another thing that I like about mudlarking, is that you find these very personal objects that belonged to individuals. And the last time that object was touched was when the person who lost it dropped it or whatever happened. And I find that, kind of is a nice thing for me. And I guess with writing, you're trying to do the same as well. So when I'm researching, and I'm sure the guys are the same, you're kind of looking for those tiny little details that bring the past to life.
Yeah, it's always those little moments that really resonate
Yeah.
with readers. And Sinead, I was thinking for you, like switching from police procedurals, which are very short, sharp, constant action, constant plot, into historical, where you have to develop so much more. Did you find that easy to make the switch, or was there something particular about the story that made you decide, I want to write this story?
Well, the main thing I wanted to write here was a ghost story. And that was something that was in my head for a long time. And I mean, some of my favourite books are, for example, Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House. And the house in this is called Hollow Park Hall, which is a tribute to that. I just knew it had to be a H. So that's where I come up with the name. So it started off as a ghost story. And funnily enough, half of the book is set in 2007 in this big house in the west of Ireland, and there is a ghost. There's a real ghost. I wanted, if I was going to write a ghost story, I wanted it to be a real ghost, you know, not one of these psychological maybes. So there is a ghost, and the first draft of the novel actually just had one little section where it set up who this woman Deirdre was, who eventually, you know, hangs around for a couple of 100 years. And the more I wrote about her story, the more I realised I wanted to know about her. Because if you have a ghost in a house, there must be a reason. There's a reason why this person hung around for 200 years. So actually it kind of organically became historical fiction, and now the novel is half and half. So the story guided itself to that direction rather than me deciding to do it, you know.
Right, so it becomes more fiction set in the past.
Completely,
than a
yeah. And the
historical.
more I wrote about her, the more I wanted to find out about her and why is she hanging around this house for 200 years.
Yeah.
So she ended up getting her entire own section to herself. So.
Right, which she well deserved, I think,
Exactly.
yes. And Vaseem, how about you? Certainly in what Bill is saying about the ordinary details that bring things to life, that's something that I really notice reading your fiction, the amount of detail that you have. Do you have a process, or does each idea create its own
Well, I mean,
world?
as Will said, you do a lot of research, and then you get rid of 99% of it, and you decide what deserves to stay. I mean, for me, the Malabar House series really is an exploration of the changing relationship between the British and Indians, following 300 years of the British presence on the subcontinent, and then the period directly after 1947 when India became independent. And it's about attitudes, and the way attitudes between India and England changed. And the old attitude of the Brits in India can be summed up by the old joke about the two colonels. Have you heard about the joke about the two colonels? So there were two colonels sitting in a cafe in Delhi, and one says to the other, well, this India is a jolly fine place, old boy. What? And the second says, couldn't agree more, old chap. There's just one small problem. And the first says, well, what's that, old bean? And the second looks out into the street, looks back, and he says, too many damned foreigners. So, and that attitude persisted right up until and beyond Indian independence. So it's like the old saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And Gandhi famously quipped, and that's because God doesn't trust the British in the dark. And these books are really about the fact that India had to come to grips with working with Britain post-independence, because there were tens of thousands of Brits who didn't leave India, who had either been born and raised there, or who couldn't bear the thought of coming back to cold, wet, miserable England without the servants and the coolies and the rest of it. And India was finally given the reins to look after her own country after 300 years. And it was a real process of changing attitudes on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting what you're saying there at the start about research, that you do all this research and then you eliminate a lot of it. There's an Irish writer, Eilish Ní Gaoimhne, I'm sure people know, who uses a lot of folklore for inspiration. And she said something about she uses them because they illuminate, the rich coloured light of folklore illuminates the grey shadows of modern life. And I feel like with all of you, that's what research is doing. You're using it to make the rich colour. So maybe, Vaseem, with you again, what are your research sources? How do you go about researching? And do you have particular ones for each book?
Well, one of my bugbears is the fact that a lot of the information we have about the Raj in the British in India was written by white men. Right? We don't have as many Indian sources for that information, although that's changing. And what I try and do with these novels is to try and look at this period in India and back through the eyes of an Indian, a woman, Persis. And the series begins with Midnight at Malabar House, where she qualifies as India's first police detective. It's a very patriarchal, misogynistic society. Nobody knows what to do with her, so they stick her in Bombay's smallest police station with the rest of the rejects and and Misfits. And the Times very kindly compared the series to Mick Herron's lovely Slough House series in terms of the setup. And I see him grinning up there in the audience. But that was high praise for me. But beyond that, it's really about how I can use that as a setup so that we look at how India has changed through the eyes of an Indian, which I don't think has been done very well for that period, certainly in fiction before.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sinead, for you, I suppose you gave yourself 3 different timelines to research. How did you approach it?
Funny, just as I'm listening to Vaseem there, it's interesting parallels in that part of my book is set during the famine, and the book is set in an old Anglo-Irish house in Ireland. And when I was chatting to my editor about it, there is an entire series of big house books set in Britain and lots of big house ghost stories set in Britain. But yet here was I writing a big house ghost story set in Ireland, which has a whole other layer, because the original family would have been considered themselves Anglo-Irish, but would have been English or British. You know, there's all of that. And then the big house stayed. The people who grow up there consider themselves more Irish as they go along. But yet when we get to 2007, the house still exists. The family are still there. The child of the house is now a grown-up man, Patrick, or Patrick, as I call him in the audio version, doesn't know kind of who he is, because he has grown up in this small village in the west of Ireland, but at the same time he's the guy from the big house. He went to school in England. He loses his accent deliberately when he goes to England, trying to fit in different places. So there's an awful lot of that relationship there. But really I use a lot of different sources. I have found podcasts actually very handy in both this book and the one I'm writing at the moment, which is set in the 1920s, because there are some fantastic history podcasts out there, and it can be, you know, we have busy lives, so if you're walking or driving or whatever, it can be fascinating to listen to a podcast and get different people chatting. You get that lovely energy of people. So I suppose a number of sources. I use both fiction, non-fiction, and then audio as well. I love reading novels set in the time that I'm writing about to see how different people do it. Not necessarily taking it as gospel, but just to get that sense of an era. Also for this one, went back and actually read some books that were written in the past to get the language. Yeah. And then the final thing I do is I do with this one and the one I'm writing at the moment, I do go to historians and get them to make sure I haven't done anything dreadful. But what I've done in both cases is written the book first and then gone to a historian to find out. Because I think if I went to a historian first, I would get so much information that I'd never write the book. But, and the one final thing, and what's wonderful about academia and historians is you will find somebody in the world of academia for any topic you want, because there's a murder in this book quite early on, and it happens in the 1840s. And when I sent the first draft off to my editor, she said, you know, one thing we need to change, you need more about that murder, because the original draft, there's a murder, and then it's 3 months later. And she went, you know, we need to find out. So she said, right, you need to find out, is there a court case or what would the investigation be? And I rang a woman I know who's a very senior lecturer in UCD, and I said, can you help? And she said, oh, I have the man for you. And she actually found an academic in UL whose specialty is homicide in famine-era Ireland. I just went, yes.
Bingo.
And the thing about academics is, if you ring them and you say, I really need information about homicide in famine-era Ireland, he goes, I've been waiting for somebody to ask me that question. So he was amazing. He's thanked in the book. So yeah, I think you will find an academic somewhere who will have that bit of information you need. But again, I do that at the end, because I think if I had gone to him in the beginning, you would have ended up with an academic book about homicide in famine-era Ireland. That wasn't very interesting, so you have to be careful with the
Of course. And it's also, I suppose, our characters are just people living their lives in the past. They're going to get stuff as wrong about their times as we get about ours. And one of the things I loved actually in your writing, Bill, is I actually learnt loads that I hadn't known in terms of details. So, for example, in House of Ghosts, about the gas masks, ill-fitting, which is something I'd never thought about, the badly made or ill-fitting gas masks contributed to loss of lives. Did you find details and think, oh, that's brilliant for the plot? Like, which would come first, possibly, in a case like that?
Well, I think, you know, as with everybody else, you do an awful lot of reading and around the subject, and you kind of pick out little details that really work for the story. So, the gas masks was something that I looked up, and then I realised that there was this whole progression. They started off pretty much with handkerchiefs that they used to urinate on, and that was kind of, they thought that might work against, didn't work, against gas. And then they had these hood ones that again weren't very effective, and then they kind of went through all this thing. But that seemed to me like it would be something that would be useful for the plot. So I kind of I went down that route. But it's little things like, so with The Winter Guest, it's set in Ireland in 1921, and I kind of, it just occurred to me whether they had electricity or not, and then I kind of ended up going down this kind of rabbit hole of electricity production before ESB was created, and there were these little private companies that would supply like 30 or 40 houses with electricity, and they might be attached to the local butcher or greengrocer or something along those lines. And I realized that this town, which I had set this novel in 1921, had no electricity, and the house wouldn't have had any electricity. And then you can use that in terms of creating the atmosphere, particularly for a story that is set in a big crumbling house, much like Sinead's, that has ghosts, and once you realize that it's all lit by firelight and candlelight, then suddenly you can see the light moving across the ceiling, and you can think, well, yes, there's a reason why all these houses had ghosts, because they didn't have electricity. You don't hear about ghosts so much these days, but then a very different situation.
Yeah, I suppose it's a similar thing to there weren't UFOs before there were airplanes.
Yeah.
So there wasn't something to see. Sinead, what you were saying there about Patrick, that not knowing where he was, having a foot in both camps, it struck me that with all of your books, you're each capturing elements of the outsider. There's the sort of other person, even when that person is very much within a system, say with Persis. So, for example, Sinead Grace in the Belladonna Maze, she's an outsider within her own family, really, and she's obviously an outsider in all the families she's a nanny to, even though there is that sort of supposedly one of the family gloss over it. And of course, she can see ghosts, which separates her from everyone. So why do you think that idea of the outsider, starting with you, Sinead, is such an important element of crime fiction? Why do you think we need that outsider voice?
Well, yeah, my main character in the modern end of this story is Grace, who is a nanny, who meets this posh Anglo-Irish family and comes back to work for their big house in the west of Ireland, thinks she's heading back to absolute luxury, and then finds out that big houses are really expensive, so she's not heading back to luxury at all. But she, like, the nanny and the big house is a ghost story trope, really, and it's a crime fiction trope as well, and I deliberately played with all of those elements. So I wasn't reinventing the wheel in terms of having a nanny going back to work in a big house and seeing ghosts flickering the corner, deliberately so. I wanted to play with that, but do it in Ireland, do it in the west of Ireland, do it in County Roscommon, which is very beautiful, but doesn't pop up in an awful lot of major, of books. And so I wanted to play with all that and do it and use it, and the nanny was the perfect opportunity to do that. And of course, a nanny is just a wonderful character in a book because she's living in the house. She has to live in the house. You're trusting her with your children, which is the most important job you can give anybody. She sees everything, but yet at the same time, she's slightly distant, and she has to keep herself to herself. Yeah. And obviously, the internal thoughts of a nanny or a childminder might be very pointed in terms of what she's seeing, but outwardly, she has to play with the children and be lovely. So she was just a great character, the perfect character to base this around.
To be both visible and invisible at the same time.
And she sees dead people, which helps.
Which is always good, yeah. And Vaseem, I suppose, particularly in relation to Persis as the first female police officer in the Indian Republic, and as you said earlier, there's plenty of people who think she shouldn't be there and doing that job. So she's within the heart of the system, but she's still an outsider. So was it very important to you to make her that outsider, that sort of othered character?
Yeah, very much so, because what we're trying to do often as crime writers is to try and create conflict for our characters. And I could have chosen a male character to explore this particular period, but then I thought, wouldn't it be far more intriguing to put a woman into a situation where she knows nobody wants her, and she's not particularly accommodating? So, I've had readers write back to say, well, why have you not made her a bit more demure and a bit more sort of towing the line? And then my response is always, well, we're perfectly happy to have maverick male detectives who are willing to go beyond the lines to try and get the job done. And Persis is very much made from that particular mold.
And her prickliness is one of the lovely things about her, because you know she's going to respond in unexpected ways and keep pushing
Such as
the plot
shooting
that
off
way.
the ear of a colleague, but these things happen. These things happen.
Accidents
These
happen.
things occasionally
Yeah.
happen. Yeah, very much so.
In terms of I was thinking when reading all of your books, place almost becomes a character as well, like a setting or a building, becomes very significant. So, for example, William, in House of Ghosts, Blackwater Abbey, it's so evocatively described. I feel if you give me a pen and a paper, I could draw a map. I'd probably even have a go at the secret tunnels and passages running underneath it, and it becomes unbearably creepy and ghostly as you're travelling with them in those. So when you're writing, how important is it to you to give the place or setting almost that character-like feel?
Yeah, well, often the places I write about are kind of made up. And so in A House of Ghosts, the house was completely made up. But when it came to The Winter Guest, I didn't really care where the house was, but it needed to be somewhere in Ireland, and it needed to be, I wanted to go there beforehand and have a little bit of a look around. And then COVID came along. So I couldn't come to the country, and the book had a deadline, so it was sort of frustrating. But I based a lot of it on Lissadell House, which there were lots of photographs online throughout its history. So I was able to kind of work around, but I still didn't really have a very good sense of the interior. So I as with A House of Ghosts, I had to draw a map of the house, and I had to do the same thing with The Constant Soldier as well, because that was also based I'd fictionalized where the house was set, even though it was based on a real place. And if you don't have a very firm sense of what you're writing about, then I think the reader knows that you don't, that the things don't quite add up, and that's what you really want to avoid. All of the research that we do, which we leave off the page, is still really important, because it means that when we're guessing stuff or making stuff up, we've got enough information to make a good guess, one that the reader won't.
It's like the wiring
spot.
of it, almost. Yeah, and I felt the same, Sinead, excuse me, with the Belladonna Maze, and also the maze itself, as well as the house. They're almost like two characters.
Yeah.
Was that a very deliberate thing you had from the start to make them feel that alive?
I'm very lucky in my day job in that I get to travel around the country a lot and see a lot of interesting things. So the house has a maze, and it is literally based on 5 or 6 places I've been. So the maze is from Russborough House, directly from Russborough House out in Wicklow. The houses are based on various big houses around Ireland, but what inspired the idea of the house was Electric Picnic and Slane Castle, and people who own big houses who try to make money out of them in the modern day. So in this particular house, it's falling down because they're really expensive, but the family are trying to, set up a glamping park in the garden so that it might be able to make some money and hopefully eventually earn enough money to do up the house and turn it into a destination wedding venue. So that's where, so it wasn't based on one particular house, but all of those came in. But I did have the most extraordinary experience after I wrote the book. The book is set in Roscommon. There is a place in Roscommon, Lougheed Forest Park, we went to a lot as kids because my dad was from Roscommon, and the house that was there burnt down years ago, so I'd been hearing the stories about it, but it's gone, Rockingham. But I based it in Roscommon as a bit of a tribute to my dad's family, and actually also because there weren't too many crime novels set in that part of the world. But the one place I didn't visit while I was researching this book was Strokestown House, which is the National Famine Museum in County Roscommon. I just had never been there. It's just the way it worked out. But in Hollow Park Hall, the woman of the house is a sculptor, and she works in a tower that is on the other side of the grounds to the maze. So after the book was written, the day after I sent it off to my editor, I had to do a story for RTE based in Strokestown House. And it was a story about glass potatoes, which are the most beautiful things that are a famine memorial. This woman has made these glass potatoes. So I headed off to Strokestown House. And as I drove up the gate, I thought, this looks really like Hollow Park. Right? Strokestown House is the National Famine Museum, and my book is set during the famine. So we went in and I met it was slightly post-COVID, so the house was still closed, but the grounds were open. And I met the manager. He was lovely, and he was showing me around, and he obviously saw me looking a little bit taken back. I said, I've actually just written a ghost story set in a big house in Roscommon, and it looks really like this. And he said, wow, that's really interesting. We're chatting away. And I said, look, don't mind me. Let's go and interview your artist, your sculptor. Is she here in the house? No, he said, she's in this tower that's just on the edge of the house. And I just paled. And he said, what? And I said, I've literally just submitted a book that is set with a sculptor who works in a tower on the edge of the house. Wow. And we all met and we all chatted, and they went to I said, I'm not making it up, I swear to God. So talk about research, I retrospectively researched Strokes. It's completely true.
That's a fantastic little epilogue to the story.
Never set foot in it before I wrote the book.
And there it was.
And I went back, I brought the kids again to Lockheed, which I always do this summer, and we called into Strokestown on the way back. So I brought the book to Strokestown, and I had rung ahead to say I was coming, and I took pictures of it outside the house, and you would swear I had based the book there.
That's fantastic.
So do I believe in ghosts? Yes.
Yes. And it sounds like you conjured one up practically by doing that. Vaseem, there's a lovely line in Midnight at Malabar House where Persea's father tells her, your mother used to say that a little piece of a person's soul is left behind in their books. Now, I know he meant the books that people owned and read, but it did make me think about writers and the traces of ourselves that we leave behind in our books. I was interviewing Jean Hanff-Corlitz for Murder One recently, and she referred to looking back over the 8 books that she's written and finding connective tissue in them with hindsight, like common themes and threads that she wasn't aware of at the time. Vaseem, starting with you, do you find that in your writing? Do you look back and think, oh, I've actually been thinking about that same thing from the start?
Yeah, very much so with this particular series, because it really is my exploration of something that's very important to me, which is my Indian heritage. I was born and grew up in England, but my parents were clearly from the subcontinent. And one of the things that struck me when I was doing the research for this particular panel was the parallels between the Irish experience and the Indian experience, which are incredible if you go through them. So clearly Ireland was treated as a de facto colony with the sham of local governance, as India was. You mentioned the famine. India had its own famine in Bengal because of, that was in 1942. The British were trying to buttress against the Japanese advance through Burma, and there were hundreds of thousands of troops in Bengal, and they decided to give all of the grain to the troops and then to take away the fishing boats from the local Bengalis. And therefore, it ended up with 3 million dead. Because of the policies and the lack of amelioration of the effects. And then you went through the independence movement, and India was fascinated by the Irish approach to the British and to the antagonism with the British, and they sent ambassadors over to India. And there's a couple of wonderful stories. So Gandhi himself, he didn't come to Ireland, but he was inspired by, now I hope I've got this name right, Terence McSweeney, is it Sweeney? Yep. So Lord Mayor of Cork, he of the famous hunger strike. Now Gandhi loved a good hunger strike. You know, drop of a hat, he'd be off on a hunger strike. And if the pair of them had actually had if they'd had a hunger strike duel, McSweeney would have won, because his hunger strike lasted 74 days, and Gandhi's longest hunger strike was only 21 days. Of course, McSweeney perished, so hollow victory. But the other wonderful story that I came up with from that particular period was a chap called V.B. Patel, and he was, he was a big cheese in the freedom movement in India, and he came over after something called the Irish Indian Freedom League or Independence League, something of that nature was established with the purported goal of a common goal to secure freedom for Ireland and for India against the common enemy being the British. And he came over and he swanned about Ireland for a bit, did a few talks, and then he urged the Irish to boycott British goods, which is what they had been doing rather successfully in India. And there was this great story that came about after he left, where a grocery store, I think it was called the India Provisions Store, was set up. And I can't remember where, somewhere possibly in Dublin, maybe Cork. And they advertised, they had this great advert out in the papers, which said, buy tea, buy Irish first, buy India second, which I don't believe for a second, because no Indian greengrocer is ever going to recommend someone else's product before his own. But it's these kind of wonderful anecdotes that came through from that period, leading directly up to the fact that then we went through partition, just as Ireland did, along communal lines. Now, I don't know what the numbers are for the number of people who in subsequent decades have died because of the Troubles, but in India, 1 million Indians killed each other. And I have to be fair, it wasn't the British who killed those Indians. 1 million Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs killed each other. But the British were, of course, culpable to a certain extent because they did not supervise the transfer of populations when they decided to enact partition, and they chopped the country up into 3. So these things are the things that sort of still irritate me, and it probably explains why a lot of white British people get killed in my books. And if that doesn't encourage this audience to buy these books, I just really don't know. I really don't know what ever will. But those are the themes. Those are the things that, yeah. So those are the common. That's the common thread that runs through the background of these. You, as crime writers, we want to write effective murder mysteries first and foremost, right? And I have a lot of cryptic clues and all of that stuff going on. But this is the backdrop that feeds into the narrative.
Do you have something, William, something similar? Do you have constant preoccupations or things you would look back and think, actually, there's this thread that is running through them all that you only spot with hindsight?
Yeah, it turns out that nearly all of my central characters have got PTSD, which I hadn't really realised until somebody asked a question for a newspaper interview. And then, oh yeah, they all do. But it's not actually that surprising, because all of my novels are set between 1917 and 1944. So pretty much all of my central characters, well, with one exception, are male. So they've all been ex-soldiers, and they've all fought in horrible world wars, which kind of hopefully we'll never see the like again. And so I think that kind of most people who had fought in the trenches or fought on the Eastern Front had some kind of psychological damage. And in The Winter Guest, it's kind of useful because. Again, reading around the subject, I was reading about Siegfried Sassoon, who famously, kind of withdrew his services from the British Army during the First World War. But he was suffering from very serious, shell shock, as they called it at the time. And when he was walking down Piccadilly, he would see, kind of horribly wounded and dead soldiers, kind of strewn across the street, and he knew that they weren't there, but he was seeing them. And it's just somebody who kind of goes through their life, and they have that kind of awareness that they're within reality, but they've got something else going on at the same time. It was very useful for the central character in The Winter Guest, who's called Captain Tom Harkin. And he is suffering from shell shock. He fought for the British Army in the First World War, and then he is now an intelligence officer for the IRA. And again, he's got the split loyalties, kind of that Sinead was talking about. So on the one hand, and that's very much true of the family, the Prendevilles, where he goes to investigate this death in an ambush, an IRA ambush of Maud Prendeville, who fought on the right side in the Easter Rising. But the death is obviously very sensitive. And so he comes into this haunted house, but so it makes the ghost element to the story a little bit different, because he's not really quite sure whether the ghosts that he's seeing are in his own head or if they're actually there. And that was kind of fun to play around with. But just that sense of disconnection as well, because on the one hand, he's Irish, but he fought for the British Army, and the Prendevilles consider themselves to be Irish, but they're loyal to, kind of the idea of the British Empire. So it's kind of those mixed loyalties are another thing that I really like to explore in novels.
Yeah, and that sense of disconnection, that's pretty quite useful in terms of plotting, because it can allow a character to be unpredictable, which can be fantastic for the reader. And one thing I wanted to actually ask all of you was, are you a plotter or are you a pantser? So is it just flying along by the seat of your pants, let's see what will happen, what will reveal itself in the book, or do you have a meticulous plan? Maybe actually, William, with you from the start, is everything planned?
Well, it's always planned, but the plan is never kept to. So, but I think you always have to know where your novel ends. And with crime novels, it's generally fairly easy because it ends with a solution or a resolution of one shape or another. So you kind of know that's where you're aiming for. Now, that solution may change as the story develops because you have a better idea. I often cycle to and from a library where I write, and I'm kind of always coming up with great ideas. It means I have to rewrite 60 pages, but kind of, so what? And that's, so I think you need to know the ending most importantly, because then you know what's important to get to that ending. And if you don't know the ending, then you're kind of writing into a void.
Into nothing, yeah. How about you, Sinead? Because I guess going from police procedurals to historical fiction, is that a completely different approach?
No, in that, well, actually, this is the first book that the whodunit stayed the same for the whole book. In my first three books, the bad person changed. Or if not quite changed, the reason was the same, but the person was different, or vice versa. Do you know what I mean? So I'm definitely not a plotter. But a lot of that has to do with the way I write, because I have a full-time job. I don't sit at my desk from 9 to whatever every day. So I have to write in short bursts, wherever I find the time, often at the moment in my car at a sideline somewhere. So to keep it fresh in my head, I kind of go in and put down bursts and ideas on the page, and I tend to write a lot and then go back and edit as I go.
Right. So you have all the jigsaw pieces, and you might make the puzzle differently.
So I don't go ABC right down to Z. I tend to write it along. But this one, because of the ghost element, I did kind of stick with the general plot. But the other thing is, you work with an editor, and this was a book with a new editor and a new publisher as well, and she was great. But the advice I would always give to people who want to write is be prepared to work with an editor. If you're going to cling on to your work of art and say nobody's changing it, that's great, but it's not going to get published. You have to be ready to work with people and to maybe disagree with them, maybe don't, but you have to be ready to bat ideas off them. And certainly in this case, both my editor and my agent came back with ideas that were better than what I had started with.
Okay.
So there was a lot of moving around.
Right, yeah. And Vaseem, just with you, did you always plan Malabar House as a series from the outset? Did you think, right, this is going to be X number of volumes with this story, or?
Yes, but that's no guarantee that the second will ever get published if the first doesn't sell. And I was lucky it won awards and it sold around the world. For me, I was recently speaking at the International Agatha Christie Festival, because my books have been compared in tone to the way Agatha used to do things. They involve a lot of cryptic clues and red herrings and alternate suspects. And for me, I think I have to plot because they're so detailed. And as Will said, sometimes you have to start with the end and plot backwards because it's a crime novel after all. But that doesn't always mean that the ending stays the same. Sometimes it does change. And sometimes it takes a very long time for these things to stay with you. The second book in the series, The Dying Day, took 20 years. I wasn't working on it continuously for 20 years, but this just gives you an insight into the life of a writer. So it began with a visit to something called the Bombay's Asiatic Society, which is a brilliant building in Bombay with treasure trove of ancient artifacts that the British brought to India, and it includes a 600-year-old copy of Dante's The Divine Comedy. A real artifact. Mussolini tried to buy it for $1 million in the 1930s, but the Indian government said, sod off, you Westerners have stolen enough of our stuff now, we've got this, we're holding on to it. And so it vanishes. Persis and Archie come in to investigate, bodies begin to pile up, they know other people are looking for it, and then she discovers a series of cryptic riddles written in verse. And when you do something like that, and then you decide to make those cryptic riddles point to real places and artifacts in Bombay, and then you rather foolishly decide to make them rhyme, that takes a lot of planning and plotting to try and get that right. So yes, I do plot.
Right. And they are incredibly well plotted, the entire series.
Thank
If
you.
anybody hasn't read them, I recommend you get them. We have time for a couple of audience questions. Vanessa is here with the mic, so if you want to put your hand up, but don't say anything till she gets to you so that we can all hear it. Do we have any questions from anybody?
One right here. Now, Kitty, can you stand up?
Thanks. Hi, if you could be any fictional detective throughout the years, any well-known detective for one day, who would you be?
What a great question. Who wants to? Sinead, how about we start with you for that one?
It is a great question. I'll probably come up with a different answer tomorrow, but right off the top of my head, wouldn't it be nice to be Miss Marple, sitting there with your own house, kind of plenty of money actually, you know, and this really comfortable life where every so often people sweep her off to grand hotels and, you know,
there's enough people
Caribbean
dying
holidays
locally.
and all sorts of things, and she's this there with her knitting, but yet manages to solve the murder. So yeah, why not? Maybe when I retire, I should become Miss Marple.
Excellent.
I've always wanted to write a version of the Miss Marple stories where she is actually a serial killer, and you know, kind of, because it is coincidental wherever she shows up, you know, people start dying. So, but I think I would be Philip Marlowe because then I'd have lots of good one-liners. So,
Great. How about you,
I'm going to go
Vaseem?
with Sinead,
Yeah.
but for different reasons. I would like to be an Asian Miss Marple because Indians invented busybodying, right? Practically. So, yeah.
Excellent. That's a great
Brilliant.
question.
Any more?
Anybody else?
Yep, here we go.
Did any of you study writing formally? Did you do degrees, masters, anything, or did you just take off and start writing?
Who would like to take that one first?
well,
Bill?
I think I actually did a master's in creative writing at St Andrews, which was taught by poets, and it was completely useless. But that having been said, I've also taught on a creative writing master's, two of them, one at UEA and one at City University of London, and both of them you ended up finishing a novel at the end of the course. And I thought that both of those were great, and I've taught lots of successful authors who are still being published. One of them is in the audience, Nadine Matheson, who, if you haven't read her books, run out and buy them. And I think that kind of creative writing masters is very useful because it you know, you're writing a novel and you've got somebody helping you the whole way along. So if you are thinking about doing that, maybe that's the kind of creative writing masters to do.
Sinead, how about
I did the opposite of a creative writing degree because I studied communications, which is all about journalism and not making stuff up. So the very opposite of it. But at the same time, I always wanted to write novels, but I really thought, you know, how do you become a novelist? Like, you can't just put that down in the CAO and off you go. So I studied communications and ended up becoming a journalist and really liking it. But the novel writing was there. But what journalism did do was teach me about deadlines and teach me about getting something finished, which is the most important thing. So many people start novels and don't finish them. But I think the discipline I learned in journalism was to finish it. And also what I mentioned earlier about working with editors, that, you know, you can have an idea in your head, but you need to be able to work with a team to get it across. So no, didn't study creative writing formally, but certainly what I learned in my day job and what I studied for was helpful.
Yeah, it is useful. I worked as a copywriter for years in advertising and design, and you get so used to somebody pushing a piece of paper back to you with the red marks all over it. It does make it easier to take correction. How about you, Vaseem?
Well, I went to the highly prestigious writing university of getting the shit kicked out of you. So I wrote my first novel age 17. I was reading Terry Pratchett's wonderful Discworld series, and I thought, this looks easy. So I wrote a comic fantasy, sent it into some agents, and told my parents that I was going to be a rich and famous writer, don't want to go to universities. One problem with that cunning plan, the book was crap. So rejected, spent the next 20 years writing 6 more novels in different genres, all rejected. So I went through that long process of trying to learn your craft, writing every day, getting hopefully slightly better at it as you progress, and then coming to the point where the writing was good enough, you just needed a right idea to land on the right agent's time at the right.
Was that hard to keep yourself motivated all that time?
Incredibly hard.
bet. Like, that's really impressive to keep going.
Very hard. But you do these things not because you're masochist, but because you love books. You love the written word. You have a passion for something. I still play cricket at my age, even though my wife tells me not to because I'm crap at that and I get injured a lot. But we love doing it, and that's why we do these things.
That's great.
I would actually add one other thing, that if you want to write, you've got to read. And, kind of, I suspect that most writers, when you talk to them, they have read constantly the whole way through your life. And each time you read a book, you're just, kind of adding another little layer of taste, kind of, or that kind of appreciation of what works, what doesn't for you. And when you're writing, you kind of want to be writing the book that you really want to read. And then, kind of write for yourself, and you'll...
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think writers are all readers. Are there any
I've
other?
2 unpublished novels, so fair play with 6. But I mean, I've 2, and you do learn so much
I
from
haven't
them,
even told you about my
particularly.
200,000-word historical Egyptian epic,
Right.
which I'm still working on,
I
and
think-
will get published one day.
I
It's
think
true
that's an
story.
entire conversation all for its own someday. Actually, I'd love to hear about that one.
If there are any agents or publishers in the audience?
Yes, who are interested in
Yeah.
a very long epic.
This is brilliant. Any more questions?
There's one here. Great.
Sorry, Vaseem, I'm just wondering, have your books been optioned for TV or film?
Yes, they have.
Okay, because they sound like they make
But the problem with
fantastic-
options, as everyone will tell you, unless you're Anne Cleves, is that most options don't get made, and particularly something like this, which would require a big budget to a team to go to India and to do that. But I'm still hopeful, so they're under option, so hopefully one day.
Great.
Keep saying on social media that you want to see it. Somebody might see.
Yeah. I think time for just one very short last question, and it's from me, actually. Because it's Murder One, I think it's okay to get our hands dirty a little bit. So do you have either a favourite murder weapon or a favourite way of offing somebody? So, Vaseem, how about you?
Oh yes, absolutely. So in the Mughal era, if you annoyed the emperor, what the emperor used to do was to invite you to the palace, arrest you, then take you out to the courtyard, invite his favorite elephant, put your head on a block, and invite the elephant to crush your head under its foot. The poor elephant wasn't to blame, but yeah, just
Right.
don't annoy the emperor.
Right. Can you top that, Will, with the favourite way of offing somebody?
Brother is always very useful.
Nice.
Yeah, kind of.
These are good. And Sinead?
I'm a total wuss. I mean, like, if my books were a film, the camera would just move away at the very last minute. So I'm a total wuss, and I do things like drugs and pillow smothering and all that sort of thing. And actually, there's a pillow smothering coming up in the book I'm writing at the moment that I'll need to find an alternative to, because I've already used that.
Oh,
but I'm
okay.
a total wuss, so I gently dispatch people.
Right. Well, I can recommend An Elephant, there's Dublin Zoo. You can head up
This
there.
particular book is set in back again in the west of Ireland in 2010. So if you can find me an elephant
I
wandering
tell
around
you what, there's a
Roscommon, I
challenge
may
to
do
us
that.
all
Yeah.
today. So thank you very much. We're out of time, but I'd like to say a really big thank you to my guests this morning at A Criminal Past, Sinead Crowley, Vaseem Khan and William Ryan. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was absolutely fantastic. It's a fascinating panel. Thank you so much, Henrietta, and thank you to our guys here. We've had a big boost of people watching online, so for you guys at home, thank you very much indeed. And we'll make sure we get your questions in the next one. Teresa might have had some questions for you for the panel too, but we can answer them online because I can put them to the people. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next panel. We have Lisa Jewell coming up at 1 o'clock, and if you are able to join online, do please tune in. Thank you.